The aroma of roasted coffee beans vanished, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of ozone and floor wax. Inside the café, the air hung heavy and motionless. Julian Vane stood by the locked glass entrance, his knuckles white against the grip of a semi-automatic pistol, the metal cold and unyielding against his palm. He did not look like a killer. He looked like a man who had reached the absolute end of his tether. Welcome to Swasti Diaries, where we peel back the layers of the impossible and look deep into the anatomy of a crime. Back in the café, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of a wall clock that seemed to be counting down to something far more lethal than a robbery. Outside, the world of the Isle of Wight continued oblivious, but here, the light filtering through the blinds created long, jagged shadows that danced across the faces of the patrons. Detective Elias Thorne stood behind the heavy steel of a patrol car, his gaze fixed on the front window. He adjusted his collar, the fabric scratching against his skin. His mind was elsewhere, plagued by a ledger he had seen earlier that morning, a ledger that shouldn't have existed. He watched Julian through the glass, noting the way the man's eyes darted toward the floorboards every few seconds. It wasn't the behavior of a common thief. It was the behavior of a man guarding a vault. Somewhere in the back, behind the counter, Marcus Thorne kept his head down, his fingers hovering inches above a concealed latch in the wood. The police perimeter tightened, sirens muted, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the low, constant hum of tension that precedes a catastrophe. The trap was set, and everyone inside was already part of the machinery. The Isle of Wight, a place defined by its isolation, where the sea acts as a natural barrier to any swift tactical extraction. For Detective Elias Thorne, this geographical reality was not just a backdrop, it was a logistical prison. The café, a modest brick-and-mortar structure tucked into a narrow cobblestone corner, presented a nightmare of sightlines. From the outside, the windows were narrow, high-set, and reinforced with a thick, layered glass that distorted the view of the interior like a funhouse mirror. Inside, the layout was a labyrinth of mahogany tables and decorative shelving, designed for intimate conversation, but now functioning as a series of interlocking barricades. The police tactical unit, positioned behind the perimeter of squad cars, could see movement, but they could not discern intent. The patrons sat motionless, their bodies hunched, creating a human shield that rendered any clean shot impossible. Every time a figure shifted, the light caught the dust motes suspended in the stagnant air, creating a shimmering veil that obscured the precise location of the primary suspect, Julian Vane. Thorne scanned the perimeter, his eyes tracing the line of the roof, the heavy iron hinges of the service door, and the specific, uneven gaps between the floorboards where Marcus Thorne had kept his gaze locked. There was a sickening lack of logic to the positioning. If Julian were truly the aggressor, he would have secured the exits. Instead, he was pacing in the center of the room, pacing with the frantic, calculated steps of someone who was trying to keep the other occupants away from the very thing they were standing on. The forensic reality was chilling. The architecture of the room itself was the weapon, and the police were waiting for a trigger that had already been pulled in ways they could not yet perceive. The perimeter tape fluttered in the damp coastal wind, a rhythmic snapping sound against the brick. Elias moved toward the back in trance, his boots crunching on the discarded debris of a life interrupted. Below a rusted drainage pipe, half buried in the wet gravel, lay a mobile phone. It was a standard model, screen cracked into a spiderweb of dead pixels, yet it felt heavy with intent. He didn't touch it immediately. He signaled the tech team. The forensic lead knelt, sliding a sterile plastic bag over the device with surgical precision. This wasn't just a phone, it was a ledger. As the device was carefully bagged, Elias looked back at the café. The layout was a puzzle of structural anomalies. Why would a hostage taker leave a digital device near the back, miles away from the primary containment zone? He scanned the ground, noting the specific depth of the indentations in the dirt. The weight of a person waiting, not pacing. The digital footprint was becoming the only truth in a room full of lies. Inside the café, Marcus Thorne remained statue still, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, not the hostages. The motive was shifting. It wasn't about the money in the register. It was about the record stored in the silicon of that phone. Elias watched the forensic specialist extract a secondary drive from the casing. The air turned heavy with the smell of salt and ozone. There were no coincidences here. Only a calculated sequence of events that had been set in motion weeks before the first siren wailed. The puzzle pieces were microscopic, hidden in the data, waiting for the decryption process to reveal the names behind the offshore accounts. The investigation had moved from the physical room to the silent, digital architecture of a crime 20 years in the making. Beyond the yellow tape, the wind carried the scent of rain and damp asphalt. A small crowd had gathered, a collection of faces pale and drawn, illuminated by the harsh, flickering pulse of blue and red cruiser lights. They were the families, the ones who had been waiting for a phone call that would never come. I watched them from the perimeter, their hands tightly gripped around woolen coats, knuckles white, eyes darting toward the cafe's front door with every shift in the wind. A woman in a charcoal trench coat stood motionless, staring at the shattered glass of the cafe window. She wasn't crying. Her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She had been here for 3 hours, yet she hadn't spoken a word to the officers. She clutched a leather handbag as if it were a shield. I approached slowly, my boots heavy on the wet gravel. She didn't look up, but her breathing hitched, a sharp, ragged intake of air. She knew. They all knew, in that quiet, devastating way that comes when a stranger's life is suddenly laid bare in the evening news. The secrets weren't just in the ledger I held in the evidence bag. They were written in the way these people stood, the distance they kept from one another, the way they refused to acknowledge the names being broadcasted by the reporters. One man, an elderly fellow with tremors in his fingers, kept checking his watch, then looking at the cafe, then back at his watch. It was a rhythmic, obsessive motion. He wasn't waiting for a rescue. He was calculating the time left. The realization hit me then. The hostages were not just random patrons in a coffee shop. They were pieces of a puzzle that Marcus Thorne had been assembling for 2 decades. The trauma wasn't just the gunman. It was the exposure of the lives they had built on top of his carefully constructed lies. Inside the cafe, the air had thickened, heavy with the metallic tang of spilled espresso and the stale, recycled breath of 7 terrified people. Julian Vane paced the perimeter, his movements erratic, his eyes darting toward the floorboards every few seconds. He wasn't watching the door. He was watching the foundation. The hostages sat in a jagged semicircle, their bodies leaning away from one another, a physical manifestation of the eroding trust. Sarah Croft sat near the center, her fingers tracing the seam of her handbag, an obsessive, repetitive motion that grated against the silence. Beside her, a middle-aged man wiped his spectacles repeatedly, the lens cloth coming away smeared with a dark, oily residue. No one spoke. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a pressurized container waiting to burst. Every time the floorboards creaked under Julian's boots, Sarah's spine would stiffen, her head snapping up like a coiled spring. She wasn't afraid of the gun in Julian's hand. She was afraid of what lay beneath the floor. I watched the forensic feed from the tactical drone, zooming in on the micro-expressions of the group. The bystander effect was in full swing. They were paralyzed, looking to each other for a signal that never came. The man with the spectacles glanced at the exit, then at Sarah, then back down at his shoes. It was a calculated retreat into himself. He knew. They all knew that Marcus Thorne, the man behind the counter, was watching them with a chilling, vacant indifference. Thorne didn't look like a victim. He looked like an architect of a catastrophe, his hands steady as he polished a glass, his eyes tracking the light fixture above the trapdoor. The psychological strain was a tangible force, warping the room until the distinction between hostage and captor blurred into a singular, suffocating reality. I retreated to the command van, the hum of the cooling fans the only sound against the static of the radio. My team had pulled the digital archives on Marcus Thorne, or whoever he was pretending to be. The ledger was a mess of contradictions, a labyrinth of paper trails that led nowhere, then suddenly everywhere. We found the discrepancy in the insurance filing. 3 days ago, the café's policy was amended. It wasn't just a simple update. It was a massive, calculated payout clause triggered by structural failure. My hands hovered over the screen, tracing the timestamp 3:14 a.m. Who files an insurance rider in the dead of night for a building they claim is failing? I cross-referenced the property history. The foundation wasn't original. It had been reinforced in the late 90s, right when Marcus, or his predecessor, purchased the site. The chemical composition of the concrete samples we pulled from the site periphery showed traces of high-grade industrial adhesive, inconsistent with basic café renovations. It was a tomb, not a business. The motive wasn't just embezzlement. It was erasure. He was planning to collapse the floor, to bury the history of the fraud along with whoever happened to be sitting on those boards. Every line of code, every line of the insurance contract, screamed of a final violent exit strategy. I looked at the drone footage again, focusing on the way Marcus held his breath, his eyes fixed on the floorboards whenever Julian shifted his weight. He wasn't waiting for the police to storm the doors. He was waiting for the perfect moment to trigger the mechanism, to pull the rug out from under 7 lives just to silence a ledger that had been gathering dust for 2 decades. The air in the van suddenly felt thin, the reality of the situation clicking into place with the cold precision of a lock turning. The silence shattered. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of a battering ram, but a sharp singular crack, a gunshot that sliced through the heavy, stagnant air of the café. My radio erupted in a cacophony of frantic chatter, but I didn't listen. My eyes were glued to the thermal feed. The heat signatures inside the room had shifted. The primary mass, Julian, was still near the counter, but a secondary, smaller signature, Sarah, had moved with calculated precision. She hadn't fired at the wall. She had fired at the structural pin holding the floorboards in place. The concrete under the unsuspecting patrons began to groan, a low tectonic rumble that vibrating through the soles of my feet even from the van. Breach! Breach now! I screamed into the comms, my voice cracking under the weight of the realization. The tactical team didn't hesitate. The front windows exploded inward in a spray of glass and tactical light. The air filled with the sharp metallic tang of ozone and spent casings. I watched the monitors as the floor beneath Marcus Thorne gave way, the trapdoor mechanism buckling under the pressure of the sudden, uneven weight. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was scrambling, his fingers clawing at the synthetic fibers of the rug as he slid toward the jagged opening. The hostages were scrambling for the exits, their movements frantic, desperate, human. Sarah remained standing, her hand steady, her weapon lowered but ready. She hadn't fired at the police. She had fired at the trap. The logic was blindingly clear now. The gunshot wasn't an act of aggression. It was a desperate surgical intervention to force our hand. We were the distraction and she was the architect of the collapse. The room was descending into total controlled chaos. The dust in the cafe had barely settled when the forensics team moved in. I stood in the doorway, the scent of cordite and burnt wood clinging to my coat. The layout was a geometric nightmare. We mapped the trajectory of the spent casing found near the floorboards, matching it against the impact crater on the wall. The physics simply didn't align. If Julian had fired from his position at the counter, the angle of deflection would have been impossible. The bullet would have struck the ceiling, not the structural pin. I knelt down, the floorboards cold beneath my gloves, and examined the debris. There was a secondary mark on the floor, a microscopic scratch consistent with a high-velocity discharge from a low angle. Someone had fired from the floor, prone, hidden by the shadows of the dining tables. I pulled up the schematics of the cafe on my tablet. The trapdoor mechanism, a hidden hatch designed to dump victims into the crawl space, was rigged with a rudimentary tripwire. The bullet hadn't been fired to harm. It had been fired to shatter the locking mechanism of the hatch before Marcus could trigger it. I looked at the evidence bags, the ledger, the spent shell, the torn carpet. Each piece of evidence pointed away from the hostage-taker and toward a silent, calculated participant. My brother's voice echoed in my head, a warning about hidden agendas. I looked at the hostages being processed by the paramedics. Sarah stood apart, her jacket stained with concrete dust, her breathing steady. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the only person in that room who knew exactly how the floor was rigged. The trajectory of that single, impossible shot was her signature. She had forced the police to breach, not to save herself, but to stop the mechanism from claiming the others. The puzzle pieces were no longer scattered. They were locking into place with a terrifying logical precision. The digital archives of the National Records Office are cold, sterile things, devoid of the desperation that birthed the files within them. I sat under the hum of a flickering fluorescent light, scrolling through the 1994 embezzlement case involving the defunct Blackwood Investment Group. My fingers hovered over the screen, the cursor blinking in a rhythmic, taunting cadence. Marcus Thorne, the man who now poured coffee and smiled at regulars, was then a junior auditor with a penchant for high-stakes gambling and a trail of forged signatures. But the name in the ledger wasn't Marcus. It was Arthur Penhaligon, a ghost. I cross-referenced the signature on the 1994 incorporation papers with the handwriting on the café's recent supply invoices. The slant of the P, the aggressive loop of the G. It was a match. The man had lived 30 years on the proceeds of a stolen life. Then I found the second file. A child's name listed as a dependent on an insurance claim tied to the embezzlement. Sarah Croft. Her mother had been the primary victim of that fraud, losing everything to the man who would eventually own the very cafe where she would find herself held hostage. The logic was chilling. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was an extraction. Julian Vane, the supposed hostage-taker, had been the lead forensic accountant on the original investigation. A man whose career was destroyed because he dared to report the discrepancy. He hadn't come to rob the place. He had come to confront the ghost. And Sarah, she had been waiting for the exact moment the trap was set, knowing that if she could force the police to break down the door, she would expose not just the fraud, but the lethal mechanism Marcus had installed to silence the past. The hostage situation was a staged collision of 2 decades of suppressed truth. Back at the precinct, the air is thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the laser printers. I am staring at the hostage list again. 3 names, 3 lives, all intersecting at a single point of failure. I start cross-referencing the database with the cold case archives from the valley. My eyes trace the threads. A common thread emerges, a betrayal from 20 years ago. Every hostage in that room has a ghost in their history, a connection to the Blackwood collapse that I hadn't seen until now. I pull the digital files, the hum of the hard drive the only sound in the office. There it is. A signature on a mortgage application dated 1998, the same street address where Sarah Croft's mother lived before the bank seized the property. Then the realization hits me like a physical blow to the chest. This isn't just about money. It is about a systematic erasure of families. I look at the personnel files of the victims. Each one had been a witness to the fraud, and each one had been systematically discredited or forced into bankruptcy by Marcus Thorne. The logic is surgical. Thorne didn't just steal their money. He dismantled their lives to ensure they could never testify. I lean back in my chair, the leather creaking in the stillness. My brother's arson case. The one I've been obsessing over. It shares the same forensic signature, the same accelerant, the same calculated destruction of documentation. I am not just looking at a cafe hostage situation anymore. I am looking at a map of a 30-year cover-up. My pulse thrums in my fingertips as I realize the police breach isn't just a rescue mission. It is the final piece of a trap that has been set for decades, and we are walking right into the center of it. I pick up the receiver. My hands are steady. The kind of steady that comes from years of staring at crime scene photos until the horror becomes just another geometry problem. I need Julian Vane to talk. Not to the tactical team, they are too loud, too heavy-handed, but to me. I bypass the standard negotiation script. Instead, I start with a name that isn't on any public record. Julian, I say, my voice low, scraping against the static of the radio line. I know about the 1998 ledger. I know why you stopped being an accountant. The line goes dead silent. The wind outside the cafe whistles against the glass, a sharp, mournful sound that cuts through the precinct's hum. I don't breathe. I wait. I visualize him standing there in the dim light of the cafe, the weight of the handgun in his grip, the way his knuckles would be white against the cold steel. I repeat the name of the offshore holding company, a series of numbers and letters that shouldn't exist. Marcus Thorne is listening, isn't he? I drop the bait. It is a gamble, a surgical strike aimed at the paranoia I know he's harboring. I hear a faint metallic click on the other end, the sound of a safety being disengaged or perhaps a microphone shifting. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't scream. He just sighs, a ragged, broken sound that fills the small speaker. He's looking for an exit strategy, and I'm the only one offering a path that doesn't end in a body bag. I lean into the microphone, my pulse drumming in my ears, and I offer him the only thing that matters: the truth about the trapdoor beneath his feet. The game of chess is over. We are playing for keeps now. The line crackled with a static that sounded like grinding teeth. Julian's voice dropped an octave, losing the frantic edge of a cornered man and replacing it with the cold, sharp clarity of a scalpel. He wasn't asking for a helicopter. He wasn't asking for immunity. He wanted a name that had been rotting in the foundation of this town for 20 years. "Bring me Marcus Thorne's brother," he commanded, his breath hitching against the receiver. My grip tightened on the radio, the plastic casing groaning under the pressure. My brother. Elias. The name felt like a lead weight in my gut. I looked at the floor, at the dust motes dancing in the harsh light of the command center, and realized the trap I had set for myself. Julian knew exactly who I was. He knew that if I brought my brother here, the entire investigation would collapse into a conflict of interest, a chaotic mess of blood ties and buried secrets. I watched the live feed on the monitor. The cafe interior was a blur of shadows, the hostages huddled in the corner, their faces pale, eyes darting toward the floorboards where Marcus stood, his hands raised in mock surrender. My fingers hovered over the radio switch. If I complied, I was walking into a firestorm. If I refused, the blood of every person in that room would stain my hands before the hour was out. The air in the precinct grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. I could see the sweat on the tactical lead's forehead as he waited for my signal. I didn't look at him. I looked at the screen, at the subtle rhythmic tapping of Marcus's foot near the hidden latch. It was a countdown, and I was the only one holding the stopwatch. I didn't answer the radio. Instead, I bypassed the tactical lead, my boots crunching against the grit of the precinct floor as I stepped toward the monitors. The image on the screen flickered, a stuttering digital pulse, as Julian Vane finally lowered his weapon. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 2 decades. Slowly, he reached into his jacket, not for a magazine, but for a weathered manila envelope, its edges frayed and yellowed by time. He tossed it onto the checkered floor of the cafe, right at Marcus Thorne's feet. The room went deathly silent. The hostages, huddled like broken dolls, didn't move. Marcus stared at the envelope, his jaw tightening, the skin over his cheekbones turning a waxy, translucent white. Julian leaned forward, his voice no longer a tremor, but a jagged blade. "Read it, Marcus. Read the ledger of the men you buried in 1994. My breath hitched. The air in the command center felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the sheer weight of the confession. I watched the monitor, zooming in until the pixels blurred. Marcus didn't reach for the paper. He didn't have to. His eyes, wide darting, trapped, betrayed him. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of a ghost ship, a man who had built his life on the wreckage of others. The tactical lead reached for my arm, his face a mask of confusion, but I pulled away. I was witnessing the dissolution of a lie. The floorboards beneath Marcus shifted, a microscopic movement that the camera caught with agonizing clarity. He was still reaching for that latch, still trying to bury the truth quite literally beneath the floor. But the game had changed. The mask was shredded. The predator was now the prey. The air in the cafe shattered, not from a gunshot, but from the sudden rhythmic thud of a breaching ram hitting the reinforced frame of the rear service door. Marcus didn't look at the door. He looked at the floor, at the seam where the wood met the linoleum. He was desperate. His fingers clawed at the hidden latch, his fingernails turning white against the dark grain. Then the flashbang detonated. A blinding magnesium-white bloom consumed the room, turning the furniture into jagged, dancing silhouettes. I watched the screen, my hands gripping the edge of the console until my knuckles ached. The tactical team moved like water, fluid and inevitable. They didn't aim for the chaos, they aimed for the source. 3 agents hit the floor, their boots skidding on the scattered debris, pinning Marcus before his fingers could complete the rotation of the mechanism. The sound of the metallic click, the sound of a trapdoor failing to open, echoed through the audio feed. It was a hollow, defeated sound. Julian Vane had already dropped his weapon, his arms raised, his face a mask of profound, hollow relief. He wasn't a criminal. He was a witness who had finally been heard. Sarah Croft stood in the corner, her hand trembling as she lowered the small, compact pistol she had used to fire that single, distracting shot into the wall. It was a surgical diversion. She hadn't aimed for Marcus. She had aimed for the wall, creating a forensic anomaly that forced us to look at the room differently. We found the gas canisters beneath the floorboards moments later. Vials of carbon monoxide connected to a crude, timer-based trigger. If we hadn't breached when we did, the room would have been a tomb. Marcus Thorne, the man who claimed to be a simple cafe owner, was hauled out in cuffs, his face pressed into the cold, dusty floor of his own deception. The ledger lay open, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the broken door, documenting a lifetime of ghosts. The neon sign of the cafe flickers outside, casting long rhythmic shadows across the crime scene tape, flickering like a failing heartbeat. Marcus Thorne sits in the back of the transport van, his head bowed, his hands shackled to the metal bench. He isn't looking at the officers. He is staring at his own reflection in the darkened window. A man who spent 20 years building a fortress out of lies, only to watch it crumble in seconds. Julian Vane stands near the curb, his jacket torn, his breath hitching in the crisp night air. He has the ledger tucked under his arm, a heavy leather-bound testament to the lives Marcus destroyed for profit. Sarah Croft remains inside, sitting on the cold floor where she waited for years to find her moment. She is not crying. She is simply existing, the weight of her father's memory finally settling into a quiet, permanent peace. As I review the final forensic report, the reality is stark. The gas canisters, the trapdoor, the offshore accounts, it was never about a robbery. It was about the slow, methodical erasure of people. Every secret carries a cost, and Marcus paid his in the currency of total exposure. The law will move forward now, grinding through the motions of court dates and filings, but the damage is etched into the very foundation of this building. We often tell ourselves that truth is a light, but sometimes it is more like a blade, sharp, cold, and final. Thank you for walking through this investigation with me. If you want to uncover more stories where the shadows hide the truth, make sure to subscribe to Swasti Diaries and turn on the notifications for our next deep dive.